I learned from the tabernacle. Well, as you remember last week when we started this, God had given Moses specific instructions in how he was to go about implementing a process that would teach the people how they were to worship God, how they were to approach him. Now, remembering for 400 years, they've been slaves in Egypt. God had been relatively silent, and so they didn't know much about him as their God. They were surrounded by many other gods in Egypt, and remember the Egyptians had gods for everything. If they wanted one, they made up another one, and hey, you got a new god. So they didn't really know who the God of the Bible was. So God has this dilemma. How do I teach my people who I am? He's taking them out of Egypt, and he has given them this time where he gave them the 10 Commandments, and at the same time he's given the instructions of how to build this tabernacle. He has given them instructions about how they are to approach him. Last week we looked at the outer courtyard, the white linen curtains with the brass pillars on each one. And that was a lesson that said to the people that this is a holy God. This is holy ground. You can't come any further, and you can't approach me unless you come in the only door. And that door was clearly marked. It was large, it was wide, it had 4 colours, and there was one way in and one way out. That was all that God provided. And it said to the people, you can stop outside if you want, but if you want to come in and you want to approach me and you want to worship and you want to have fellowship with me, you come in this way. And they had to make a decision. And this morning we pick it up where, let's say, you decided to go in through the one marked entrance. What could you expect as you walked through this gate? Well, the first thing that you would find is this, is the bronze altar. It stood right in front of you. And the plan is expressed, and we pick this up in our reading in chapter 27, 1 to 8. It says, you are to make the altar of acacia wood, 7.5 feet long, 7.5 feet wide. The altar is to be square. Its height is to be 4.5 feet. You are to make its 4 horns on its 4 corners. Its horns will be part of it, and you are to overlay it with bronze. You are to make its pots for the ashes, its shovels, its tossing bowls, its meat hooks, its fire pans. You are to make all those utensils of bronze. You are to make a grating for it, a network of bronze, and you are to make on the network 4 bronze rings on its 4 corners. You are to put it on the ledge of the altar below, so the network will come halfway up to the altar. You are to make poles for the altar, poles of acacia wood. You are to overlay them with bronze. The poles are to be put into the ring, so the poles will be on 2 sides of the altar when carrying it. You are to make the altar hollow, out of boards, just as it was shown to you on the mountain, so they must make it. So here's God's plan expressed for this item of furniture. It's a bronze altar. It was big enough. It hit you right in the face when you walked into the tabernacle. And that's what I'm saying here in the next part. The position is endorsed. Think for a moment, you're one of the Jewish people. You're a person who's standing outside this white linen fence of the tabernacle. You're curious. That's human nature is. And the curiosity is, you want to find out what's inside. You know, the curiosity is building. I want to find out what's inside. And you've been told that, hey, if you come in, you can meet with God. You can personally meet with God. And so you've got this curiosity, what would it be like? But you can't. This white linen fence is a barrier. It is reminding you that you're not worthy. It's reminding you that there's only one way that you can get in, and it's through this front gate. As you stand looking at the tabernacle, this white linen fence, you know that you're guilty. You've heard the thunder of God's law. You've felt its conviction on your life, and it's happened to you again and again. That's what the law does. It tells you you've sinned, you've sinned, you've sinned, you've broken the law, you've broken the law, you've broken the law. You got that every day. It reminded you that you're guilty. You're guilty before God. You've looked for some way in, some way that you can bypass this fence, some way that you can come to God on your own terms. But you know, no matter what you did, that fence stops you. There's no way around it, and it frustrates you. But not only does it frustrate you, it also convicts you that you are guilty at the same time. And of course, there's a human logic that says you don't want to die. Because you know that if you tried to get in your own way, to climb over the fence, dig under the fence, go any way inside that fence except the entrance, it meant instant death. So you knew that if you did it your way, death would be the result. So it's not something you want to challenge or be confronted by. But that's the situation. So what are you going to do? You see this fence. You know that what God has said, and he has said very specifically, there's only one way you can come in. This is through this big eastern gate. It's not something that you could easily miss. It was wide enough for everybody to enter. It was easy to see and find. It had 4 bright colours on it. So you swallow your pride, you take a deep breath, and you start going forward slowly. And you enter the gate. And there you're confronted by this bronze altar. It's the first thing you see as you enter. You can't bypass it. It's right in front of your face. So you have no option but to approach it. And this is God's statement to anyone who wishes to come into his presence. You must pay the penalty for your sin. You must make atonement for your sin. You must make a sacrifice of a lamb on that altar. Only by the shedding of his blood could you go any further. The same principle applies today for any person who wants to approach God. They must make an atonement for sin. They must make things right by the shedding of the blood of an innocent lamb before their sins are forgiven. You see, you're just like that person that stands outside the fence. You're interested. Your curiosity is there. You want to find out about this God. Is he real? What's he like? But this barrier that says you can't come to me, you can't bypass the way that I've presented to you. If you do, you'll die. So if you want to find out who I am, if you want to know about me, then come this way. So you had to enter. And the first thing that you're confronted by is your own sin. The brazen altar tells us you have to deal with your sin. Later, Karen. Oops. And the purpose of it is explained. What was the purpose of this altar? Why did God insist that they build one in the tabernacle if they were going to worship in the proper way? This altar was where the sacrifice for sin was placed. And once it was placed, it was burned with fire. It was consumed as an offering unto the Lord. But before they could be placed there, each animal that was offered had to go through some very exact and stringent procedures and had to be killed according to some very detailed instructions. This brazen altar standing at the gate of entrance represented the claims of a holy and righteous God. And that claim was that he must be satisfied before his grace and mercy can meet with man and bless him. In other words, man had to make things right with God through a sacrifice. Now, as you look closer at this altar, you would see that there was no elaborate engravings on it. You would see there are no steps that you had to go up and down. And certainly, as you look at it, would you describe that as beautiful and a must-have item in your own home? Was there anything about it that would make you desire it and want it? And the answer is no. There was nothing beautiful about it at all. And of course, as you looked at it, if you had your way, you would bypass it altogether, or even worse, you would get rid of it. There's nothing about it that would make you want to worship it in any way, shape, or form. It was horrible, it was brutal, and it was eye-opening. It was confrontational. And of course, you see, that's what it looked like. The brazen altar stood flat on the desert sand in the courtyard of the tabernacle. It was at the right height, it was level for all human beings, and it stood in stark contrast to the pagan altars that would draw Israel in to make sacrifices later on, that were situated on high and steep places that they had to go up to worship their gods. As you look at the history of Israel, they were drawn away to the high places in the mountains to worship the false gods. Here, this was flat. There was no going up. It was just in stark contrast. There was no elaborate ceremonies or anything else. What confronted you was this altar and what it meant. You had to understand what it meant. So to approach this bronze altar was easy enough. Not much effort really. No steps to climb. You came to the altar in a simple way, just as you were. And this altar is the place where sinful man meets with God. It is the place where God meets with us around the altar of sacrifice. This is something he has provided. This is something that he's instructed. There's no other way. So you've gone through the gate and you're confronted by this bronze altar. You can't go any further. There's nothing special in design. It was simple, hollowed out box made of acacia wood, overlaid with bronze cladding. It stood 1.4 metres high, 2.1 metres wide, with 4 horns at each corner. It had a brass grate extended through its middle with brass rings fastened at each corner. It had wooden staves covered with bronze through the rings to carry the altar around. It was the largest piece of furniture as you entered the courtyard. It was always open. It was always available 24/7. If somebody wanted to go and make things right with God or make an atonement, it was available, and they could deal with their guilt and their sin. So it's a confronting experience for every person who came through that gate. First of all, they're hit by this bronze altar that convicts them about their sin and their need to do something to make things right before God. But the bronze altar has a deeper meaning that is taught more than what a person first sees. We look at the acacia wood. It's used to make most of the furniture in the tabernacle, but it is a reference to the humanity of Jesus Christ. He was God and he was man. He was the only man who was sinless in his human nature. The bronze covering over the altar represented the judgment of sin that was poured out on the altar. And what that does, it shows us a deeper meaning that Jesus Christ was the perfect sacrifice for our sin, where God's wrath was poured out on judgment upon him at the cross of Calvary. Now, I wonder if you can guess, what were the 4 horns used for? One on each corner. What were they used for? Remember, the blood was sprinkled on those as well. What were they supposed to represent? Or what do you think they were used for? Possibly tie the animal to it? Maybe. Or did it have a deeper meaning? You see, the four horns of each corner of the altar represented the power that was used to bind the sacrifice to the altar. The blood was sprinkled upon each corner from the sacrifice that was offered. The horns point us to Jesus Christ's commitment to carry out his Father's will when he allowed himself to be nailed to the cross. The four blood-stained horns at each corner represent the four corners of the world, and they remind us of the saving power of Christ's blood as witnessed throughout the world. So there's a deeper meaning that takes place. God is teaching his people about who he is. This is him, their very own God. Now, the priests in their duties and responsibilities had to make sure that the bronze altar was ready for use at any time. And to do that, they were given the tools that were necessary. The pans and shovels to remove the ashes of sacrifice and dispose of them outside the camp in a clean area. The ashes remind us of the finished work of Jesus Christ, who was put in a clean place at his burial. The blood from the sacrifices was drained into a basin, poured out at the base of the altar, representing Jesus Christ, who poured out his blood on our behalf. The hooks that held the flesh of the sacrifices in place represent the cruel hands of the men who nailed Jesus to the cross. The censers which carried the fire from the brazen altar to the altar of incense represent Jesus Christ's intercessory ministry of prayer at the Father's throne for us. The brazen altar was an integral and important part of worship. It was the first important step in making things right with God. And that's what its purpose and intention was. It confronted a person about their sin. It said to the person, you are not worthy to meet with God unless you do something. And the brazen altar was the place where you could meet with God and God could meet with you. But it had to be on his terms. Now, how did that take part? And you learned quite a bit. The procedures evaluated. You walk through, here is this brazen altar. And you and I sit here and we look and say, oh yeah, it doesn't do much for me, Pastor. Well, if you put yourself in the shoes of the Jewish person just for a moment, I want you to see how traumatic this was. It confronts people about how serious their sin is, and it was no laughing matter. Sin was not something that could be taken lightly, because this was the first step in the process where a person could come into God's presence. So it was important. God's instructions were exact. There was no room for any adjustments. There were no optional extras, so to speak. God's instructions were precise. They were explicit. They were to be followed to the letter without any deviations permitted. Otherwise, that sacrifice was not permitted or accepted by God. God's demands for the sacrifice were to express his standards of holiness and righteousness. And what it's saying is sin cannot enter the same space as God. It cannot be anywhere where he dwells. It must be covered by a blood sacrifice. And we get a little bit of this in understanding of this. I think I'll put it up in Leviticus 1:1-4. It says, Then the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the meeting tent. Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when someone among you presents an offering to the Lord, you must present your offering from the domesticated animals, either from the herd or from the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he must present it as a flawless male. He must present it at the entrance of the meeting tent for its acceptance before the Lord. He must lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted for him to make atonement on his behalf. So there's some very basic requirements, the very, very basic requirements of the sacrifice to be presented to God. It must be an animal that is sacrificed. It must be an animal. So I'm sorry, but no vegan substitutes are allowed. It had to be an animal sacrifice. The sacrifice must have blood that gives life, and it must come from a herd or a flock. God's requirements. Wasn't left up as an optional extra. Oh, I think that's barbaric. I think that's too bloodthirsty. Oh, I can't do that. How cruel on the animal. This was God's instructions. There was no consensus. There was no opinion. There was no protest. This is what I require. And it was made plain. It must be a male. Well, that's discrimination, isn't it? What's wrong with the female? Why did the males have to be sacrificed? Anyone got an answer? It's to remind us that it wasn't Eve that brought condemnation on all of mankind. Eve was deceived by Satan and fell for his lies. Adam, however, it's a different story. He willfully disobeyed God's commandments. A male sacrifice was required. Every sacrifice had to be laid upon this brazen altar, pointed to a type of Jesus who would fulfill the law and become our blood sacrifice. The other requirement was it couldn't be just any old animal. No. It had to be perfect and without any defects. And this was done to remind us that you can't bring whatever you want. You can't bring your leftovers, something that you got no use for, something that, I won't miss it if it's gone. No, God says, I want the very best. I want the perfect ones, without any spot or blemish. That's what I want. Because God demands nothing less than absolute perfection. Anything less, I won't accept it. The sacrifice must be offered at the doorway to the entrance of the tabernacle, the only way to enter the courtyard, where the brazen altar stood before the holy place. This was designed to teach the people there was only one door, and for us there can only be one entrance into God's kingdom, and that is through the Lord Jesus Christ. God's truth doesn't change. We hear many voices tell us, all religions are the same, you just get there in different ways. No, they don't. According to what God says, there's one way, I've told you what it is, that's the only way that I'll accept you. You can't bypass it. You can't go to another religion and say, I decided to become a Hindu, I'll get to see God. You'll get to see God as your judge, but you won't enter his kingdom. Because he said the only way that you can come into my presence and be part of my family is through the Lord Jesus Christ. Here he's teaching his people. There's only one way to do things, the way I've designated. The sacrifice had to be given freely. In other words, there were no strings attached. It had to come from a person who was grateful and repentant. In other words, they came with an attitude of gratitude to give thanks to God that he was going to deal with their sins. Not, I guess I better give it to God. He's asked for it, so I better do it. No. It was somebody who had a grateful heart. He, the person who is offering the animal as a sacrifice to atone for his sin before a holy God. Now, the instructions are precise concerning sacrifice, but even more so about the animal that was sacrificed and what was to be done with it before it was acceptable to God. So they're the basic requirements of what you had to do. But I want us to understand this idea of sin, it extracts a terrible payment. There's a penalty that must be paid. And as we continue in Leviticus 1:15 through 17, it gives us more instructions. Because what was offered, it couldn't be done without care. It couldn't be done with indifference. It couldn't be done without care and compassion. It couldn't be from a detachment. Because what God required of the person bringing it, it was personal. You were involved. You were part of it. Our verses tell us, then the one presenting the offering must slaughter the bull before the Lord, and the sons of Aaron, the priest, must sprinkle the blood and splash the blood against the sides of the altar, which is at the entrance of the meeting tent. Next, the one presenting the offering must skin the burnt offering and cut it into parts. And the sons of Aaron, the priest, must put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. Then the sons of Aaron, the priest, must arrange the parts with the head and the suet on the wood that is in the fire on the altar. Finally, the one presenting the offering must wash its entrails and its legs in water, and the priest must offer all of it up in smoke on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a gift of soothing aroma to the Lord. If his offering is from the flock for a burnt offering, from the sheep or the goats, he must present a flawless male and must slaughter it on the north side of the altar before the Lord. And the sons of Aaron, the priest, will splash its blood against the altar side. Next, the one presenting the offering must cut it into parts with its head and its suet, and the priest must arrange them on the wood that is in the fire on the altar. Then the one presenting the offering must wash the entrails and the legs in water, and the priest must present all of it and offer it up in smoke on the altar. It's a burnt offering, a gift of soothing aroma to the Lord. If his offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, he must present his offering from the turtle doves or from the young pigeons. The priest must present it at the altar, pinch off its head, offer the head up in smoke on the altar, and its blood must be drained out against the side of the altar. Then the priest must remove its entrails by cutting off its tail feathers, throw them in the east side of the altar into the place of fatty ashes, and tear it open by its wings without dividing it in two parts. Finally, the priest must offer it up in smoke on the altar on the wood which is in the fire. It's a burnt offering, a gift of soothing aroma to the Lord. Now, pretty gruesome, don't you think? Can you imagine you have to do that today? That's what's required of you today before you can meet with God. How many of you would be willing to do that? What's up with you? How many of you would be willing to take an animal and do what's required?
I think they love their animals.
They did. But they had to offer what they loved to the Lord. It was a sacrifice. And I want us to notice that sin is personal. The sacrifice itself must be personal. And the person who's offering the sacrifice is actively involved in it. It can't be done by somebody else. It can't be done from a distance, like hook up and zoom and tell somebody else what to do. No, you had to do it yourself. You had to be there and do it whether you liked it or not. Nobody else was going to do it for you. You had to kill the sacrifice. Something that you had known and was part of your family. You had to walk up to it, slit its throat, or wring its neck because you're the person who brought it. Ooh, ooh. you also had to cut it into pieces. Youch. You had to catch the blood. You had to handle every organ under the direction of the priest, who watched everything that you did to make sure it was presented and done in the right way. In other words, you couldn't take a shortcut and say, oh, I won't do that, I won't do that. No, the priests were watching. You had to follow instructions. You had to do everything they said. Now, you've killed the animal. Oh, that's over and done with. But that wasn't the end of it. You had to skin the animal. You had to cut the carcass into pieces, each piece with the skeletal fat or suet exposed. And this reminds us that in the same way the Lord was beaten with the scourge, with that whip, with bits of stone platted onto its ends for the specific purpose of taking flesh and skin at each stroke, so was the sacrifice skinned before offering. So it's a picture of what the Lord has taken on our behalf as our sacrifice. He did it for us. But you, if you're an Israelite, you had to bring the sacrifice and you had to kill it and you had to skin it. As the priests were busy arranging the kindling and wood for the sacrifice fire, some parts of the slain animal separated for special reasons. You'll notice you had to remove the legs and place aside with the entrails. The priests would lay them in order, the dismembered body on top of the wood, which makes me wonder, the four corners, you wouldn't have to bind them there because you've already killed the animal, you've cut it up in pieces, you're placing them on there already. The legs of the animal represented that part which had encountered the world and is contaminated with sin. God is teaching them through the use of an animal how the world contaminates us with sin. It's contaminated. We can't be removed from it. We're part of the world, and as such, sin contaminates our lives. The entrails represent that part of the animal which has encountered the world by taking it in and digesting it, making the elements of the world a part of the body. The dirt that remained on the legs represents the outer sinfulness. The filth of the entrails represented inward contamination from taking in the world. Both are to be washed. And that's showing us the cleansing by the washing of the word that makes us acceptable to enter God's presence. Everything about this sacrifice was then consumed by the fires of judgment. Everything. There was nothing wasted. So it's a pretty gruesome thing that confronts you. You walk through that door and bang, there's the altar. And you know what's required. You know what's coming. You know that this is personal. You are involved. You have to do the killing of the animal to present it. Now we're told that the children of Israel, not all of them were wealthy. They didn't all own herds or cattle or sheep, so God made a way for them to sacrifice as well. And what that's showing us and teaching us is that nobody, not a person, is excluded from the requirements that God demands regarding his holiness and his righteousness. It doesn't matter whether you're poor, you're rich, in between, God says you must do it my way. There's no exceptions. There must be a sacrifice. We all need atonement for our sin. We've all fallen and come short of the glory of God. Every one of us is to bring. There's no mention here of the qualification of the offering, and it demonstrates to us that God accepts what he has placed in our hands and that you are to give according to how he has prospered you. But even so, there are certain principles that must be kept even in giving this offering. The bird is to be slain not by the giver but by the priest before being offered on fire. Its blood is allowed to drain and placed on the side of the altar. Now, there wasn't much blood from these small sacrifices to allow the priests to sprinkle it upon the horns of the altar. But the blood that was shed was still acceptable to God and consumed by the fires of judgment just the same. So it's not about the amount of blood that was shed, but the quality, the purpose, and the way it's given. It still required blood from an innocent sacrifice that was offered. Somebody else had to pay the price for a person to be made right with God. The sacrifice not only did something for man, but it also did something for God. He was pleased with the sacrifice. When Jesus died on the cross, the fire of God fell in judgment. And though it wasn't pleasant, God was well pleased with what was offered. He died not at the hands of men, but of God. As Isaiah 53:10 and 11 says, "Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see of the travail of his soul and shall be satisfied." So what it's teaching God's people is sin separates people from a holy God. Sin separates. It's no laughing matter. It contaminates everything it touches. And only a blood sacrifice could make things right. But it had to be compliant with God's requirements. In other words, you had to follow the letter before it was acceptable. The principle is explained for us. Sin is not pleasant. It's devastating for the Jewish person. Think about it. You're confronted by this brazen altar. You're confronted by death and dying. You're confronted by the sight of fire, the smoke, the blood and the smell of burning flesh. That would have been a terrifying experience to go through. Knowing that this animal that you had personally slaughtered was offering as a sacrifice, paid the price for your sin. It wasn't impersonal. It was to remind people just how serious sin is and was. It's not something to be taken lightly. Today we say, "Oh yeah, I'm a sinner, yes, yes." And we forget it cost somebody to pay the price for our sin. Judgment on sin is never a pleasant sight. Never. And we go right back to the beginning of man's rebellion against God. This concept of sacrifice was established when God killed an animal to provide a covering for Adam and Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. The most important instruction was that there was to be only one altar. It was located only in the court of the tabernacle. One place of sacrifice guarded against the influence of heathen worship. But it spoke to Israel. It speaks to us today that there's only one sacrifice for sin, and that's the Lamb of God. That's the person of Jesus Christ. That's the only acceptable sacrifice. The brazen altar and the cross of Christ both speak of justification. This does not mean that we're made righteous, but we are declared righteous. In other words, put in a right relationship with God. In the days of the tabernacle, the Jewish people were restored to a right relationship with God by offering a blood atonement on the altar. Today, the atoning blood of Christ takes away sin and restores and reconciles Jews and Gentiles together alike. Justification is not obtained by any work that we do. It's bestowed freely through the grace of God, and it results in the removal of guilt and punishment of sin, the righteousness of Christ being imputed to our lives, and our restoration and favour and fellowship with God. And this is the beauty of the good news of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ paid the penalty for your sin and my sin. Complete, in full. He took and exchanged my robes of righteousness, which are filthy, and he put on me the righteousness of Jesus Christ. So that's why I have a right standing before God now, because when God looks at me, he doesn't see my sin. He doesn't see me as a perfect person, but he sees the righteousness of Jesus Christ on me. In other words, the righteousness of his Son has been placed upon me. Just as the lamb was offered on the sacrifice, God saw that sacrifice and accepted it. That's why he accepts you and I. And the good news is that I can know my sins are forgiven, past, present, and future. I don't have to bring an animal in every day and sacrifice to make things right with God. Somebody else has done that for me, but it cost him dearly. In Leviticus 9:23 and 24, Moses and Aaron then went into the tent of meeting. When they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat portions on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted for joy and fell face down. What it tells us is this. The first sacrifice of the tabernacle that God accepted was consumed by fire that came from his presence. God consumed that sacrifice. It was acceptable. The Israelites had prepared the sacrifice. They placed it on the altar. They put the wood underneath, but it was God who literally made that first sacrifice of the tabernacle. Approaching the tabernacle of God without an offering, a proper sacrifice on the altar, it meant certain death to the person. If we reject the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross, then we'll be separated from God and we will face eternal death. Now, I know many people have heard this and say, yeah, I've heard all this before, Pastor. But you know, there might be a day that's coming and it'll be too late to say, yes, I should have done it. Because once you're dead, it's too late to make that decision. And you might have heard it all your life and say, oh, wait till I'm a little older, a little wiser. I got plenty of time. No, today's the only time you've got. You don't know what's going to happen when you walk out this door. There's always got to be one that's got to be, think the absolute worst. But what it means is none of us have got a guarantee that we're going to live forever. None. Anything could happen. So now is the time to really think. And I took a service here on Thursday for a young man. None of his family could be here. They were down south, but it was live streamed. This was a young man who had many opportunities to trust the Lord, and some point in his life he did. But he wandered away. And he wasn't that old, but he died unexpectedly. And I can tell you, the hardest part for me was when I buried him. Because all those people that came, they were his workmates, they were people, and most of them had never heard the gospel. Most of them didn't have a concern for the gospel. And when I buried him, they didn't know how to deal with it. There was wailing, there was crying, there was grief. And they were trying to deal it by taking the shirts off their own backs and putting it in, because that's what he would do. They celebrated with a fountain of beer all over the place. And I thought to myself, well, it's not going to help this man anymore. He's gone. But none were prepared to listen. That maybe it's your turn. Would you be ready to face a holy and righteous God and say to him, I live my life this way because? No. Now's the opportunity. Now is the day when you need to be confronted. Sin is real. You know, we're talking about the coronavirus. We can't see it, yet its impact is impacting people. There are millions of people are dying. People are in fear of death and dying. There's an even more, a worse epidemic, and it's called sin. It's unseen, it's invisible, and it will kill you. Now, people are, shall I say, putting all their eggs into one basket and hoping these vaccines will do the job they're supposed to. But you know, I want a better guarantee than maybe it will work and maybe it won't work. Whereas when it comes to sin, I have a cast iron guarantee that the blood of Jesus Christ covers all my sin, past, present, and future. And as a result, I'm guaranteed of eternal life. That's something I can bank on. I can know that's real. But are people concerned with sin and its effects? Not today. Not today. What will it take? You see, God had a dilemma. He's trying to teach his people who he is. And there are very extenuating circumstances and difficult times that are happening in our world that are challenging our faith. When circumstances we don't want, when things happen in our life that we never expected, where do we turn and how do we respond? Because what it does for those who claim to be Christians, it challenges us. What is God doing? Why doesn't God answer my prayers? I prayed and he didn't do this and he didn't do this and he should have done this. Where was he? And so as a result, because God didn't answer their prayer or God didn't give them what they want, they've wandered away. They've got rebellious and said, if that's the God of the Bible and that's how he treats me, I want nothing to do with him. Wow. You see, God's not there for us to demand anything from. He has laid it out. This is how much I love you and care for you. I have provided a sacrifice that you couldn't. I've made it acceptable, but you've got to come my way. I have the answers to life. I have a purpose and a plan for you. But you know what? You've got to trust me. He's teaching the people who he is, that he's going to take them to the land of milk and honey. But he didn't say, I'm going to make this nice and easy for you. No more problems, people. Just follow me and life will be a breeze. No. He's promised there'll be trials and there'll be temptations along the way. But he's promised, I'll never leave you nor desert you. I'll be there with you in the midst of it all. And I'll lead you to where I want you to be. I'll give you that peace and that patience. I'll give you everything that's necessary. But will you trust me? The brazen altar is to remind us that this is where reconciliation with God takes place. Sinful man meets God at the altar of sacrifice, and God meets sinful man there as well. That's where it starts. You don't go any further until you meet God at this place. He's teaching the people, do it my way, or you'll never enjoy my presence. You'll never be able to approach me. And the same thing is for us today. We can't approach God on our own terms. We can't demand anything of God. God says, this is the way that I've prescribed. I'll meet with you, you meet with me, and I'll provide for all your needs. But you must do it my way. And that's the challenge of this message this morning. The bronze altar stands there and it convicts us of who we are and what we need to do and what God has said. Come this way or don't come at all. As the team comes.